Morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. If anybody was keeping track or could actually hear me over my daughter's noises yesterday, we did the last pasuk of the parsha already yesterday. So what I'd like to do today, at least what I'd like to begin with today, is I'd like to share a few comments from the Sefer HaChinuch on mitzvos from this parsha. Obviously, there's a lot of technical things in this parsha, but to sort of get a little bit more of a perspective on some of them, I think might be worthwhile. So near the beginning of the parsha, there's a very famous pasuk. It says, Eish Tamid, it's chapter 6, verse 6, Eish Tamid Tukad al Mizbeach. There has to be a regular flame on the altar in the Beis HaMikdash. And this exists, this instruction exists, whether or not there's an offering being brought at the time. That, of course, is a very interesting thing. So the Sefer HaChinuch, if anyone's interested, it's mitzvah 132. The Sefer HaChinuch says that there's a mitzvah lahavir eish al mizbeach kol yom tamid. There's a mitzvah to light the flame on the mizbeach every day. Shenemar eish tamid tukad al mizbeach uboa perush shel tamid klomer lohasim bo eitzim baboker bein harbayin. The meaning tamid is always a confusing word because tamid could be translated as always. Tamid could be translated as daily. So it's a little bit tricky sometimes what it means. So the Chinuch says what it means in this context is that they have to put wood for the fire on the altar in the morning and in the afternoon. And there's a very interesting Gemara. The Gemara says, we say that in the Beis HaMikdash, certainly the first Beis HaMikdash, there was a miracle that the flame came down from the sky. So you would think, in this time of year where everyone has to-do lists, so you would think that the fire is on God's to-do list. So what does there have to be a mitzvah of placing the wood for the fire twice a day? It's already a miracle. But nevertheless, we have a mitzvah to do our actions in terms of seeing to it that there's a fire, and then God makes there a miraculous flame. Don't ask a question. What's this mitzvah all about? So fine, we dealt with the fact that God does what he does, but we have to do a fire on our end. Fine, but of course we have to light a fire on the Mizbeach. Without lighting a fire on the Mizbeach, how could we ever burn anything on the altar? So what's the big to-do? There's already instructions of how to bring korbanos, and part of those korbanos involve fire. So what's the big to-do about the fact as a separate mitzvah that we have to always have a fire on the Mizbeach? Of course we would have a fire on the Mizbeach daily. We would need it for the korban. Ki mitzvah zu b'fnei atzmahi. This mitzvah stands alone. Kil milvad eish hatzarach lekorban hayuborim eish b'mizbeach lemitzvah zu. Even at a time where there was no sacrifice going on, there was a mitzvah that there should be flame on the Mizbeach from us. Okay. Mishrashei mitzvah. So why is this important? Hakdama. So he says it's an introduction. Yodua davar beinenu v'yetzel kol chacham. Among us, we understand this. Any wise person understands. Kinisim gedolim asher yaso hakel el bnei adam betuvo hagadol. They are great miracles which God does for people in his abundant kindness. Liolam yasam derech seiser. Generally speaking, when God does miracles, he does it in somewhat of a hidden way. V'nirim ha'inyanim nasim k'tzas kiloim b'darkei teva mamish o b'karov l'teva. That generally speaking, when God brings a miracle, you could see part of it connects to the laws of nature, or it's like almost well explained on a natural level. This is, of course, one of the challenges for us as believing Jews. There are so many miracles that we look at in our history tremendously, and then we pull out some article, and the article says, well, what's the big deal? There was just this wind that would happen to be blowing at such a time. That's what he's talking about. And it shouldn't bother us that we see articles like that. That's how miracles are supposed to be. Miracles from God are supposed to be, generally speaking, that they fit in some way with nature. My gosh, the splitting of the sea. It was this famous miracle. Kasuf Sham. God made it that through the night there was this strong wind coming. So, like, what? So if God wants to see the split, he has to like rev up his engines. He has to have the wind coming through the night. Without the wind coming through the night, God couldn't figure it out. He should just snap his fingers, kaviyachol, and then just split the sea. But the point is the same thing, that this is just the way God operates. Of course, we understand it's a miracle, because when else in the history of the world did a wind cause the sea to split? But he tries to do it in some sense, within the realm of nature. So if you really think about it, you'll understand that this is part of God's greatness. In other words, that he makes it that it doesn't have to be so obvious that he exists. He does what he does, and it's our challenge to challenge the people of this world to be able to look at what happens in this world with fresh eyes and an honest approach, and to reach the appropriate conclusions. So says the Chinuch, that's why God instructs us to light the fire on the altar. Even though there's also a fire coming down from heaven, it's kind of like the wind for the splitting of the sea. Let it be that we light a fire, and then God also brings a fire from heaven. It was, generally speaking, it happens to be on the 8th day. I guess we'll get to this next week, God willing, in Parsha Shmini. But on the 8th day of the dedication, there was like this clear flame that came down from the heavens. But besides that, since the Chinuch, it wasn't necessarily so obvious. If you didn't assume anything, it wasn't so obvious there was a flame coming down from the heavens. We lit a flame, and then God made it miraculously continue. So this is an interesting perspective on miracles in general. A nice thing to think about as we come into Pesach, and specifically on this mitzvah of lighting a fire on the altar. But he says, but let's think about this. Why would it be important to God anyway that there be a flame always on the altar? Like, I get it. When you happen to bring a sacrifice, you need a flame. He connects this to a comment that he made by the showbread. A person is blessed based on the actions that they undertake for the honor of God. So he says that through Klal Yisrael's efforts for the showbread, this was part of the service in the Beis HaMikdash, through Klal Yisrael's efforts for the showbread, that blessed all of the bread among the Jewish people. In other words, through the actions about the bread in the Beis HaMikdash, that extended blessing to everyone's table. So he says it's a similar thing with the fire, that every day they light a fire on the altar. They do something that the fire on the altar should continue, and that blesses every person's fire. What does it mean to bless every person's fire? What's this fire? It's part of the nature of a person. It's one of the 4 elements within a person. Again, whether or not we would say this today scientifically, that it's one of the symbolisms that there are 4, the 4 elements of the earth, that we have them in ourselves also, and fire is one of them. But what it represents is that's how a person gets inspired. That's what makes a person act. If you think about it, if you think of that, that's what fire represents, a person's motivation in life, a person's inclination to get up and do. That's the fire within them. And that requires great blessing. The idea of that blessing is to be complete. Klomar, davar she'ein bo chesaron v'lo mosar. That we shouldn't be missing anything, and we shouldn't be to excess. The flame within each and every one of us certainly needs this blessing. that we should have the right determination and get up and go. Lo pachos, we shouldn't have less determination than is appropriate for us. Ki yecholesh kocho, because if we had less than was appropriate, we'd be very weak. We'd be very unmotivated. V'lo yoser, ki sarifpo, and we shouldn't have more than what we need, because if we had more than what we needed, we'd be burnt by the fire. We'd get into fights. We would extend ourselves too far. All kinds of mistakes. It's interesting. He says this is represented. Again, I don't know what he's talking about, but we can relate to it, not in a scientific way. It's represented when a person gets a fever. So if a person's fever is too high, they die. Right? A person could be deathly ill with a terrible fever. That's a mushal. Again, on our level, we'll look at it as a mushal. That's what happened. That's represented that the fire within a person could be too strong. Of course, by the way, if a person doesn't have a high enough temperature, they could also die. So it's a very interesting mushal. Okay, so I thought this was just an interesting thing to think about, a whole different perspective on a very technical point. This image of flame on the mizbeach even is good for bar mitzvah rushes. My son's bar mitzvah last year on this parsha. Okay, so one more mitzvah over here, and that's mitzvah 143. Mitzvah 143, and that is the idea of burning leftovers from sacrifices. It's a big deal. And actually, ironically, part of the idea of burning chametz, at least according to one opinion in the Gemara, part of the idea of burning chametz is because we learn burning chametz from burning leftovers from sacrifices. And it's a positive mitzvah in the Torah that if there are leftovers from sacrifices, all sacrifices are only allowed to be eaten for a certain period of time. So leftovers from sacrifices, they're supposed to be burnt. What's that about? Why is it so important to burn them? So I'm in the middle of mitzvah 143. Mishrashi mitzvah, from the roots of this mitzvah, is fisheteva kol basar li pased b'shehiyah v'lo v'ledei sircham. It happens when you leave meat out, right? It's true for all flesh in this world that if it just sits, it rots. V'yalkein la'agdalas tvar korban k'bo shamarnu l'mala nitztavinu l'sorfu miyad u'levaro min ha'olam v'yakutz adam bo berecho. Just an interesting practical point. It shouldn't be that a person walks by a korban and says, "Oh, that stinks. Oh, that looks disgusting." It shouldn't be. This was a way that we connected to God. So we don't want to leave around the meat from a korban because it could become unpleasant to the eye, to the scent. So the way to totally destroy something is through fire. So it's just that's an interesting thing to think about, that the mitzvah of burning leftovers from a korban is indirectly a way of showing honor to the korbanos. Yoser midei latznio liyom machar viroso ki akel yitzav alichlos b'sar kodesh mishavar shato kil yom gamer v'lo rotz shkiana bo birya acharkein lo adam v'lo behema. It's an interesting thing. He says there's also a little bit of a mushal about faith in God connecting to all of this. That the idea is that the idea of a korban is there's a certain amount of time you're supposed to eat from it. And then afterwards, whatever is left over, but you don't worry about it anymore. And what will be tomorrow will be tomorrow. And he says that's a little bit of a mushal for worrying about things in life. That we shouldn't worry too much. I need to eat all of this because if I can't preserve it for tomorrow, what will be tomorrow? You know what? God will help you take care of tomorrow. Interesting perspective. So we spoke about the idea of the flame on the altar, and we spoke about the idea of burning leftover offerings.